Chapter 1. Before the plague, long before the word plague carried weight in whispered conversation, a European town in the 14th century woke as it always had. The morning began not with silence, but with layers of small, familiar sounds. A cartwheel creaked as it rolled across uneven cobblestones. A church bell gave a slow, measured toll. Smoke rose thin and blue from low chimneys. The air carried the scent of damp earth and wood ash. The town was not grand. It was like most towns. Clustered wooden houses leaning slightly inward over narrow streets. Roofs were thatched or tiled, patched and repatched. Rainwater gathered in shallow ruts. Straw absorbed refuse and mud. Life here moved according to rhythm, not speed. At dawn, shutters opened. Bakers were already awake, kneading dough in low-ceilinged rooms warmed by brick ovens. The smell of baking bread drifted outward into the street, heavy, comforting, reliable. In one house, a woman poured water from a clay jug into a wooden basin. It was cold, metallic. She washed her face, her hands, and began her morning tasks. There was always something to mend. Children rose early. The world outside called to them. They ran barefoot between the buildings. Dogs barked. A pig nosed through discarded vegetable peelings. The church dominated everything. It stood not merely as a building, but as a presence. Its bell governed time. Its priest governed morality. Inside, the air smelled of wax and incense. A woman knelt in prayer, her whispered words dissolving into the vaulted ceiling. Faith was woven into life. Illness existed, of course. Fevers came and went. Winters were harsh. Infant mortality was common. But sickness was understood in familiar ways. A bad humor, a chill, a punishment perhaps, a test. No one yet imagined something that would empty entire streets. Beyond the town walls lay fields. Men walked outward carrying tools across their shoulders. The soil was heavy but dependable. Farming was relentless, but it was known. You planted, you waited, you harvested. The seasons were more powerful than kings. Spring meant lambs and muddy boots. Summer meant sweat beneath the sun. Autumn meant harvest and relief. Winter meant smoke, hunger, endurance. Trade threaded through the town like a quiet current. Merchants arrived with carts. Cloth from distant regions. Salted fish from the coast. Spices, rare and precious. Carried along long trade routes that stretched far beyond what most townspeople could imagine. In the marketplace, voices layered over one another. A butcher called out prices. A woman haggled over onions. A blacksmith hammered iron into shape, sparks flashing. His arms were thick with repetition. The sound of metal striking metal echoed sharply. Coins changed hands slowly. Most exchange was small, practical. Eggs for cloth scraps. At midday, the church bell rang again. People paused. Some crossed themselves. Time was not kept by pocket watches, but by sun and sound. Inside homes, meals were simple. Stew thick with barley, cabbage, salted pork. The town was not clean by modern standards. Waste was thrown into the street. In the afternoon, apprentices worked beside masters. A young boy learned to plane wood smooth. A girl sat beside her mother spinning wool, the spindle turning rhythmically. Skill passed down. Literacy was rare. Knowledge was practical. Travelers occasionally passed through the town gates, carrying news from beyond the horizon. News moved slowly, distorted by distance, but the town felt insulated, protected by its walls, anchored in routine. As evening approached, light shifted from gold to amber. Long shadows stretched across the street. Livestock were guided back into enclosures. Shutters closed once more. Fires were stoked brighter. Inside the tavern, low voices gathered over ale. Wooden cups thudded gently against tables. Stories were told, exaggerated, retold. Laughter rose and fell. The night was darker than modern night. Darkness carried weight. The sky above, unpolluted by city glow, revealed a dense scatter of stars. The Milky Way was a visible river of light. In narrow streets, footsteps echoed more sharply after dusk. The town watch made a slow round. In one house, a mother hummed softly, while a child drifted toward sleep beneath a wool blanket. Everything felt ordinary. Everything felt enduring. Life expectancy was shorter, but predictable. People expected hardship. They expected loss. But loss came individually. A failed harvest. A fevered child. They did not expect absence on a scale that would hollow entire regions. Somewhere far beyond the town, ships were docking in Mediterranean ports. Sailors were unloading cargo, grain, silk, furs, and something unseen. But here, in this quiet northern town, no one sensed it. The baker prepared tomorrow's dough. The priest extinguished candles one by one. The blacksmith banked his forge. A stray dog curled beneath a cartwheel. The town slept beneath a sky vast and indifferent. Wind moved softly along the walls. A loose shutter tapped once, then settled. If you stood in the street in those final months, you'd see nothing unusual. You would smell bread, hear bells, watch smoke climb gently into the evening air. The world felt stable. Generations had lived and died here. The stone church had stood for over a century. Hardship had come before and then survived. There was no sense of approaching rupture. Only routine, only rhythm, only the quiet certainty that tomorrow would look much like today. And for a while longer, it did. Chapter 2, Rumours from the East. At first, it did not arrive as illness. It arrived as a story. Stories traveled the same roads as wool and grain. They rode in the backs of carts, crossed seas in ships, and passed quietly between merchants warming themselves beside roadside fires. They changed slightly with each telling. In early months, rumors felt unreal. Beyond Europe's borders, whispers of a sickness emerged. Not an ordinary fever. Something heavier. Something that emptied houses in a matter of days. A chilling, unknown threat. But distance dulls urgency. In an Italian marketplace, a trader mentions quiet streets in a Black Sea port. In a French tavern, a sailor describes ships drifting into harbor, crews too weak to tie ropes. In noble courts, letters arrive, describing cities unsettled by sudden death. Yet, it feels far away. To those in small inland towns, these stories felt like echoes from another world, distant, unreal. Trade routes stretched like invisible threads. Spices, silk, and grain moved across continents for generations. These routes carried wealth and news. And now, though unseen, they carried something else entirely. In Mediterranean port cities, ships arrived from the east. Their sails hung heavy, hulls creaked. Sailors disembarked pale and exhausted. Illness among sailors was not unusual. Voyages were harsh. But this sickness did not behave like others. Men fatigued in morning were delirious by nightfall. Fever burned quickly. Pain spread beneath the skin. And then, within days, silence. Some ports hesitated to allow ships to dock. In others, trade pressures overruled caution. Goods were valuable. Delays were costly. Cargo was unloaded. Crates carried ashore. Rats slipped from mooring ropes to cobblestones unnoticed. No one connected the pieces. Further inland, in cities like Florence and Marseille, rumors grew more insistent. Chroniclers wrote cautiously of unusual mortality. Physicians debated causes. Some blamed corrupted air, miasma. Others suggested celestial events. Unfortunate alignment of planets. The medieval world understood illness through balance. When that balance tipped, sickness followed. When first clusters of deaths appeared, explanations were sought within familiar frameworks. Incense burned thicker in churches. Windows were shuttered. Fires lit in streets to cleanse air. Vinegar was dabbed beneath noses. But the rumors continued to travel northward. Merchants in Lyon spoke of entire households lost. Pilgrims in Avignon described funerals without full rites. Letters told of markets thinning and graveyards filling faster than expected. Still, many believed. Europe had endured hardship before. Famine and wars were common. Disease was not new. But this felt, at least at first, like an intensified version of the familiar, not unprecedented. In the town we left in the previous chapter, life continued much as before. But occasionally, a traveler passing through would speak more quietly than usual. In the tavern one evening, a cloth merchant described streets in Genoa where doors were closed for days. He had seen carts collecting bodies wrapped in linen. He spoke without embellishment. His voice carried fatigue more than drama. Some listened politely, then returned to their ale. Others shifted uncomfortably, but said little. Fear does not ignite fully from distant sparks. In monasteries and schools, scholars pored over texts seeking precedents. Ancient Roman writings. But those belonged to another age, another empire, another world. The medieval mindset was deeply rooted in faith. If illness spread, it was interpreted spiritually. God tested humanity. God corrected humanity. God expressed displeasure. But in these early rumor-filled months, theology had not yet sharpened into crisis. Instead, there was confusion. In Paris, physicians issued statements explaining celestial conjunctions. This celestial disturbance, they reasoned, had spread illness. An attempt at order. In smaller towns, the news arrived slower. Weeks after a port city, inland settlements heard. The time lag softened urgency. It created the illusion of safety. After all, if such devastation were truly unstoppable, surely it would have arrived already. Summer air grew warmer. Crops continued to grow. Children still played in streets. But along major trade routes, the arteries connecting Europe's regions, something was moving steadily. Caravans traveled from city to city. Wagons stopped at inns. Goods were transferred. With each exchange, invisible passengers transferred as well. In certain towns along the Mediterranean coast, mortality rose sharply. Graveyards expanded. Chroniclers began to write more urgently. Words like pestilence and great mortality appeared. Some described swellings beneath arms and in groin, painful lumps that signaled rapid decline. Others wrote of fevers so intense that victims seemed consumed from within. Yet these accounts felt distant. In the countryside, peasants working fields under wide skies felt removed from port city crisis. The land appeared unchanged. Birds still crossed the horizon. Streams still flowed. But roads connected everything. By late 1347 and into 1348, the pattern became harder to ignore. Town after town reported deaths. Monasteries recorded passing of entire communities. Priests struggled to keep up with last rites. The speed of the illness unsettled observers more than its symptoms. It did not move like famine. It did not resemble common fevers. It struck swiftly. Yet many communities clung to normalcy. In our quiet town, the priest addressed rumors during Sunday Mass. He urged prayer. He spoke of trust in divine will. He did not speak of panic, no clear enemy. Merchants continued to arrive, though perhaps fewer. One mentioned a cousin in the south fell ill. Another claimed entire villages near the coast stood abandoned. But no one had seen it. The bell still rang. The baker still prepared bread. The marketplace still filled with conversation. Yet beneath the surface, something had shifted, not in bodies, but in awareness. Conversations lingered longer. Travelers questioned more closely. A subtle hesitation crept into exchanges. People began to watch strangers with faint curiosity, edged by unease. Wind carried the scent of autumn approaching. Harvest would soon begin. And somewhere along the roads that led toward the town, along the same paths that carried wool, salt, and stories. A cart was making its slow way northward. The town did not yet know that its final weeks of ordinary life were passing quietly. Rumors had arrived first. Reality was not far behind. Chapter 3. The first deaths. It began quietly. There was no announcement, no trumpet of warning, no sudden shift in the sky or change in the wind. The town woke one morning much as it always had. The bell rang, smoke lifted from chimneys, carts creaked along the road. And yet something subtle had entered the pattern. The first illness did not seem extraordinary. A dock worker in a nearby river town had fallen ill after unloading goods from a merchant caravan. He complained first of exhaustion, which no one found unusual. Work was heavy. Sleep was short. He returned home early that evening, lay down near the hearth, and told his wife he felt an unusual heat behind his eyes. By morning, the fever had worsened. Such fevers were common enough. They rose with the seasons. They passed through households and then faded. The local healer was summoned. She examined him with practiced calm, pressing a hand to his brow, noting the dryness of his lips. She muttered something about imbalanced tumors and instructed his wife to prepare an infusion of herbs. Bloodletting was considered. When the body overheated, it was believed that excess blood or corrupted fluids might be released. A small incision was made. Dark blood filled a bowl. The healer watched carefully for signs of relief. But relief did not come. By the second day, he struggled to sit upright. His speech grew confused. Pain pulsed through his limbs. Beneath his arm, a swelling formed, tender, deep beneath the skin. His wife noticed it while attempting to cool him. She did not yet understand its meaning. In another part of the region, a merchant who had recently arrived from the south collapsed. He had appeared tired when he first arrived, pale, thin, unusually quiet. The innkeeper assumed he had endured a difficult journey. But within 2 days, he too was delirious with fever. Word began to pass more quickly now. The town physician, a man educated in university theory and accustomed to treating minor ailments, was called repeatedly. He examined the swellings carefully, darkened lumps near the groin or under the arms. He consulted his books. He spoke of corrupted air. He advised that homes burn aromatic herbs to cleanse the atmosphere. The priest visited the sick. He moved from bedside to bedside with a steady expression, offering prayers, placing cool hands upon overheated foreheads. He reassured families that suffering was not meaningless, that illness had purpose beyond mortal understanding. Yet the pattern grew difficult to ignore. Within days, the dock worker died. He was buried quickly. Not because of fear, not yet, but because decomposition came swiftly in warm weather. The funeral was modest, but proper. People returned home unsettled, but still convinced this was an unfortunate, isolated tragedy. Then another fell ill, and another. The swellings appeared again, painful, darkening, unmistakable once recognized. The fever burned fast. The time between first symptom and death was sometimes no more than 3 or 4 days. There was something deeply unsettling about the speed. Medieval life was familiar with slow suffering. Famine starved gradually. Old age weakened steadily. But this illness seemed impatient. It did not linger. It consumed. Inside homes, families began to close shutters more often. Not fully, but partially. A cautious dimming of openness. The healer found herself overwhelmed. Her knowledge, once sufficient, felt fragile against this force. Herbs offered little improvement. Bloodletting brought no relief. Cooling compresses did not break the fever. The physician wrote letters to colleagues in larger cities, seeking guidance. He received responses filled with speculation, but little certainty. Some believed the disease traveled through air. Others suspected contaminated water. Some spoke of divine wrath. Theories multiplied. Answers did not. In the marketplace, Conversations shifted tone. Laughter grew less frequent. People began to count the sick in whispers. Still, daily life did not fully halt. Bread was baked. Fields were tended. But beneath the routine lay tension. The church bells began to ring more often. At first, each toll marked a single funeral. Then 2 in one day. Then 3. Grave diggers worked longer hours. The swellings, now spoken of in hushed tones, became a sign none could ignore. Families who saw them appear understood what might follow. Mothers held children closer. Husbands avoided sleeping too near fevered wives. Fear entered not as panic, but as watchfulness. Doors were not yet barred, but neighbors hesitated before visiting the sick. Some left food outside rather than stepping fully inside. The priest continued his rounds, though exhaustion lined his face more deeply. He heard confessions from men who believed their illness was punishment. He offered last rites more frequently. In certain houses, entire families fell ill within days of one another. There were moments of eerie quiet in streets that had once been lively. The town council met to discuss precautions. Fires were lit in certain areas to cleanse the air. Citizens were advised to avoid large gatherings. Yet the church could not close. It was the center of spiritual life. And so people continued to gather, though they spaced themselves slightly farther apart. Some attempted to flee. A few families packed belongings and left for countryside relatives. But departure required resources, and travel carried its own risks. Moreover, many believed the illness was already present everywhere. There was nowhere clearly safer. The psychological shift was profound. Before, illness had been unfortunate but contained. Now it felt ambient, like weather settling over the town. At night, sleep became lighter. People listened for coughing in adjacent rooms. They lay awake, counting their own breaths. When a healthy young man collapsed suddenly after working in the fields, denial finally cracked. Strength offered no protection. Age offered no pattern. The illness did not discriminate cleanly. The graveyard expanded. Soil turned repeatedly. Yet through all this, there were still moments of strange normalcy. A child laughed in the street one afternoon. This contrast unsettled many more than open chaos would have, because life and death now coexisted in the same narrow lanes. In some homes, windows were nailed shut. In others, incense burned constantly. Vinegar was carried in small cloths. But the disease moved regardless. The physician, once confident in scholarly explanations, began to speak less assertively. The healer stopped promising recovery. The priest's voice grew hoarse from repetition of last rites. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, hope shifted from expectation of recovery to prayer for mercy. The first deaths had broken routine. The town now understood that Rumours had not exaggerated. Something had arrived. Not a passing fever, not a seasonal hardship, but something larger. And it was only beginning. Chapter 4. Collapse of Order. There is a moment in every crisis when the familiar structure of life does not shatter all at once, but loosens. It begins with small absences. The baker does not open his shutters at dawn. The blacksmith's forge remains cold. A cart sits unmoved in the street for days. At first, these are isolated interruptions. But as the illness spreads, interruptions begin to overlap. The bell tolls so frequently that it loses distinction. What once marked individual loss becomes a constant sound. It rings in the morning. It rings again before noon. It rings at dusk. Sometimes it rings so often that people no longer count. The graveyard cannot keep pace. Gravediggers, exhausted and fearful, begin to work in groups. In some cases, neighbors lower bodies into earth themselves, murmuring fragments of remembered scripture. The marketplace thins. Stalls that once overflowed with goods now stand half empty. Merchants have fallen ill. Others have fled. Some simply refuse to travel. Without regular trade, goods grow scarce. Prices rise quietly at first, then sharply. Bread, once dependable, becomes inconsistent. The baker struggles to grind grain without his apprentices. The miller's son has died. The mill wheel turns more slowly now. Fields lie untended. Crops that should be weeded or harvested begin to droop. A farmer too weak to rise from bed cannot bring in his grain. Livestock wander beyond fences. Sheep bleat unattended. There is something profoundly unsettling about abandoned labor. Medieval life depended entirely on constant physical effort. When that effort falters, the land shows it quickly. In homes across the town, doors remain closed for reasons no one wishes to confirm. Families inside may be ill, or already gone. In some streets, silence gathers unnaturally. The tavern, once loud in the evenings, sits nearly empty. Those who remain avoid lingering. Conversations are brief. Voices are low. Fear changes the way people move. They step wider around others. They hesitate before touching shared surfaces. They study each cough, each flushed cheek. And yet, there is no clear protection. Some households attempt isolation. They seal themselves inside, lowering shutters and refusing visitors. But food must still be fetched. Water must still be drawn. The priest, once steady in presence, begins to show signs of strain. He performs last rites daily. He listens to confessions through partially open doors. He baptizes infants quickly, in case they do not survive the week. Then one afternoon, he does not emerge from the rectory. Word spreads quietly that he has taken to bed with fever. This absence shakes the town more deeply than any merchant's death. Without spiritual leadership, uncertainty widens. In larger cities across Europe, similar patterns unfold. Entire monasteries lose half their monks within weeks. In certain regions, entire villages fall silent, their houses left intact but empty. Chroniclers later write of grass, growing in streets once crowded with people. But in this town, the collapse is experienced intimately. A mother must choose whether to remain beside her fevered child or leave to fetch water, risking exposure. A husband watches helplessly as his wife weakens. A young apprentice wanders unsure how to proceed. Authority fragments. The town council, meeting with fewer members each week, struggles to enforce order. Some propose restricting entry through the gates. Others suggest forbidding large gatherings entirely. But enforcement becomes impossible when those tasked with maintaining order fall ill themselves. The town watch grows thin. At night, lanterns swing through darker streets with fewer hands to carry them. In some quarters, watchmen cease their rounds altogether. And the soundscape changes. Before the plague, the town had been layered with constant activity. Hammering, haggling, livestock, children, bells marking time. Now, long stretches of the day pass in near quiet. No hammer strikes the anvil. No laughter echoes from the schoolyard. Wind moves more audibly between buildings. Occasionally, a cart rattles by, carrying bodies wrapped in linen, not dramatically, simply a necessary task. The smell of the town shifts too. Where once bread and smoke dominated, now there is the faint, unsettling scent of too many burials. Incense burns constantly in some streets, thickening the air in attempts to purify it. Some interpret the plague as divine punishment. Public processions form, though smaller than before. Citizens walk barefoot, chanting prayers for mercy. Others begin to question more quietly. Why this town? Why this year? Faith does not disappear, but certainty softens. In households where all but one member have died, survivors move like shadows. They speak little. They perform necessary tasks automatically. Grief becomes too common to fully express. The healer, once moving constantly from house to house, begins to ration her visits. There are too many calls, too many fevers, too many swellings. In certain moments, she pauses outside a door before knocking, gathering strength not for physical labor, but for what she expects to find inside. And still, the disease advances. In some regions of Europe, mortality climbs so high that labor shortages begin altering economic structures. Fields left unharvested lead to food shortages. Wages where labor remains rise unexpectedly. But such shifts are invisible in the midst of crisis. For now, survival occupies every thought. The rhythm of the town has not merely slowed, it has fractured. Where once time moved predictably, now days blur together. Funerals replace festivals. Silence replaces commerce. Children who remain alive sense the change. They are kept indoors more often. They watch adults whisper. They feel tension like humidity in the air. At night, the darkness feels heavier. Without tavern noise or street chatter, every footstep echoes sharply. Every distant cough seems amplified. Sleep comes in short fragments. In some homes, entire families choose to remain in a single room together, fearful of separation. In others, the sick are isolated behind closed doors, meals slid through narrow openings. Trust erodes gently, but unmistakably. Neighbors who once shared tools now hesitate to approach. The town walls, once symbols of protection against external threat, offer no defense against something already within. And so the collapse of order is not loud. It is not marked by fire or invasion. It is marked by absence, by the blacksmith's cold forge, by fields bending unharvested in the wind, by the church bell ringing so often that its meaning dulls, by the simple fact that each morning fewer shutters open. The plague does not conquer with armies. It thins, it hollows. It loosens the threads that bind a community together until the fabric hangs slack. And still, there are those who survive. They move through this altered landscape cautiously. They fetch water. They tend the sick. They bury the dead. But they do so in a town that no longer resembles the one it stood only months before. The structure remains: stone church, timber-bird houses, narrow streets. Yet something essential has shifted. Order has not shattered. It has faded. Chapter 5: Faith, Fear, and Blame. When suffering stretches beyond understanding, the human mind searches for meaning with urgency. By the time the plague had taken dozens, then hundreds, it was no longer an unfortunate season of illness. It had become something larger, moving with intention, though none could see its mechanism. Explanation became a necessity. The church, though diminished, remained the first place many turned. Faith provided structure when medicine could not. If God governed all things, then surely this calamity had purpose. Sermons grew heavier. Subtle messages of patience gave way to sterner reflections. Priests spoke of sin, pride, and moral decay. They pointed to recent wars, greed in trade, vanity among the wealthy. Perhaps they suggested the plague was correction. Not all spoke this way. Some emphasized compassion. Others admitted God's reasons were unknowable. But the atmosphere within churches shifted. Incense burned thick and constant. Candles multiplied along stone walls. Attendance fluctuated. Some gathered more fervently, kneeling for hours, whispering prayers until voices trembled. Others avoided enclosed spaces, fearing the breath of neighbors. Religious processions formed across Europe. Lines of men and women walked barefoot through streets, chanting penitential hymns, carrying crosses and relics. They beat their chests or struck their backs with cords, seeking mercy through visible repentance. In larger cities, flagellants traveled from place to place, believing intense physical penance might persuade divine forgiveness. Such processions passed near the town, a column of weary figures moving slowly under gray skies. Their presence unsettled some and comforted others. Fear and devotion can look remarkably similar. But faith was not the only response. When explanation feels insufficient, suspicion often follows. Minority communities were accused of poisoning wells or spreading disease deliberately. These accusations were unfounded, born from panic, not evidence. Yet fear can magnify old prejudices with terrifying speed. In the town we observe, violence did not erupt, but whispers circulated. People looked at outsiders differently now. Travelers were questioned more sharply. Strangers found doors closed more quickly. The desire to locate a cause became urgent. If the plague was punishment, repentance might end it. If it was poison, the poisoners could be removed. If it was corrupted air, then fires and incense might cleanse it. What was unbearable was the idea it simply existed without reason. Inside homes, private faith intensified. Mothers knelt beside beds longer than before. Fathers murmured prayers they had not spoken since childhood. Religious tokens were placed beside pillows. The town's surviving clergy, stretched thin and fatigued, continued their rounds. Some displayed extraordinary courage, entering infected homes repeatedly despite risk. Others, human and afraid, performed blessings from thresholds. Faith did not eliminate fear. It lived beside it. There were moments of profound tenderness. A young boy carrying water for an elderly widow too frightened to step into the street. The healer continuing her visits, even as she knew her remedies offered little relief. And there were moments of fracture. A man refusing to open his door to a coughing friend. A family concealing illness to avoid isolation. An argument in the marketplace over suspected exposure. Blame shifted subtly, sometimes without words. Those who had recently traveled were regarded cautiously. Merchants found themselves greeted with distance. Trade slowed further, not only because of death, but because of suspicion. The town's atmosphere thickened with dread. Did prayer seem to shield some families? But the answers refused to settle into clarity. The plague struck unpredictably. One house might lose every occupant. The house beside it might remain untouched. This randomness destabilized theology and logic alike. If sin explained suffering, why did infants die? If corruption caused illness, why did pious monks perish in clusters? If divine wrath was targeted, why did it seem so indiscriminate? Such questions were rarely spoken aloud in sermons, but they lingered in private thought. Meanwhile, across Europe, chronicles recorded a similar pattern. Cities emptied partially. Trade routes quieted. Labor shortages began altering social hierarchies. Survivors sometimes found themselves unexpectedly inheriting property or land. But these structural changes were invisible to those still within the height of crisis. For now, survival remained immediate. As autumn approached, colder air brought a subtle shift. Some believed the disease would fade with changing seasons. Others feared winter would only deepen suffering. The town had lost enough that collective memory of before felt distant. Children born during the plague would grow up in its shadow. Those old enough remembered the vibrant marketplace. And crowded tavern felt the contrast sharply. Yet daily rituals continued in fragmented form. Bread was still baked, though less frequently. Fields were harvested, though by fewer hands. Church bells rang, though now often for mourning. Faith did not collapse under the plague. It transformed. For some, it hardened into fervent devotion. For others, it quieted into private contemplation. For a few, doubt began to grow, a questioning that would echo into later generations. But those long-term shifts were still far in the future. In the present, what mattered was endurance. The town moved through days heavy with uncertainty. It searched for meaning in Scripture, in ritual, in community. Even as community itself thinned, the plague had not only hollowed streets, it had unsettled certainty. And in that uncertainty, people clung to prayer, to family, to small acts of kindness, hoping mercy might yet be found. Chapter 6. Living with Death. After the first wave of panic and desperate prayers, something quieter settled over the town. Not peace, but exhaustion. The plague did not rage loudly every hour. It moved in pulses, a cluster of deaths, a day of uneasy calm, and more fever, more swelling, more silence behind closed doors. And gradually, people began to live beside it. There is a strange human ability to adapt even to catastrophe, not because the catastrophe lessens, but because the mind cannot remain in constant alarm. Fear, sustained too long, becomes dull. It flattens into routine. The bell still rang for the dead, but now it no longer startled anyone. The sound folded into the background of daily life like wind against shutters. Graves were no longer dug one by one with ceremony. Pits were opened in advance. Bodies were wrapped quickly, sometimes without coffins, lowered with efficiency rather than ritual. A short prayer, a handful of earth, and back to work. The grave diggers stopped speaking much while they labored. They had seen too many faces. Inside houses, families reorganized space. The sick were often moved to one corner of a room, separated by nothing more than a blanket hung from a rope. Food was left nearby. Water was changed carefully. Sometimes the ill recovered. It happened rarely enough to feel miraculous. When someone survived the fever, neighbors would murmur that perhaps God had chosen them for a reason. Survivors moved with a quiet, fragile awareness, unsure why they remained when others had not. But survival did not mean safety. No one knew if the illness could return. Daily tasks resumed not because fear had vanished, but because they had to. Cows still required milking. Bread still required baking. Wells still required drawing. Fields, though diminished, still needed tending. The town had shrunk. Houses stood empty, their doors slightly ajar. Furniture remained inside. Bowls on tables. Shoes near hearths. Entire lives paused mid-motion. Some homes were taken over by distant relatives or neighbors seeking more space. Others were left untouched, as though inhabited by memory alone. The air in certain streets felt different. Without the usual traffic of people and animals, dust gathered more thickly. Weeds pushed up between cobblestones. The absence of sound became its own presence. At night, darkness felt wider. Where once candlelight flickered in many windows, now only scattered points of light broke the black. The stars above seemed brighter, almost intrusive in their clarity. Inside surviving households, conversations shifted. People no longer asked whether the plague would reach them. Instead, they asked whether it had finished with them. The distinction was subtle, but profound. Hope changed shape. It was no longer hope for complete restoration of the old life. It became hope for simple continuation. One more week, one more harvest. One more winter survived. Grief altered as well. At the beginning, each death felt sharp and singular. Now, loss accumulated until it blurred. Entire families vanished within days. Names were spoken softly, and then not at all. There were moments when someone would begin to speak of the past, of the crowded market, of festivals, of music in the tavern, and then fall quiet, as though the memory itself required too much energy. Children adapted more quickly than adults. Those who survived played again in narrower groups. They avoided certain houses instinctively. They asked fewer questions than before. The world they were growing into already contained absence. The healer continued her rounds, though slower now. She had lost friends. She had lost patients she once believed she could save. Her remedies had not changed. Herbs, poultices, careful rest, but her expectations had. She no longer promised recovery. She offered comfort instead. The town council, reduced to a handful of men, met irregularly. They discussed practical matters. Redistribution of land left without heirs, management of grain stores, repair of walls that no longer had enough hands to maintain them. Across Europe, similar adjustments were taking place. Labor shortages were reshaping social structures. Survivors found themselves in unexpected positions of leverage. Wages in some regions began to rise because workers were scarce. But in the town, these changes were still abstract. For now, survival consumed attention. Winter approached. Cold air carried a new kind of quiet. Frost gathered along rooftops. Smoke from chimneys drifted lower in the heavy atmosphere. Some believed the cold would cleanse the disease from the air. And indeed, as weeks passed, the number of new deaths began to slow. Not stop entirely, but slow. The bell rang less frequently. Graves were dug less urgently. People began to step slightly farther from their doors. There was hesitation in this movement, like emerging from a storm cellar, unsure whether the storm had truly passed. In the stillness that followed the worst months, the town felt hollowed but intact. Stone buildings remained. The church still stood. The well still offered water. But the human landscape had changed irrevocably. A third of the town, perhaps more, was gone. Some streets were permanently thinner. Some professions were nearly extinguished. Memory hung in the air like lingering smoke. And yet life persisted. A woman gave birth in late winter, her child's cry cutting through the quiet. It felt almost startling in its vitality. A young man, newly responsible for land his father once worked, walked the fields at dawn, calculating what he could manage alone. A widow reopened her small stall in the marketplace, selling dried herbs. To the reduced, but slowly returning crowd, living with death did not mean becoming accustomed to it. It meant carrying it. It meant accepting that absence would remain part of the town's architecture, as surely as stone walls and wooden beams. The plague had not ended completely. It would return in waves in future years. But the first great shock had begun to ease. In its wake lay emptiness. And within that emptiness, the fragile beginnings of continuation. The town no longer resembled the one described in the first chapter. It was quieter, older, altered, but it was not erased. Smoke still rose from certain chimneys. Bread still baked in limited ovens. The church bell, though scarred by months of tolling, still marked the hours. And in the spaces between loss, life, subdued, cautious, but undeniable, continued to move. When the plague finally loosened its grip, it did not announce its departure. There was no final day when the bell rang and then fell silent forever. No clear morning when someone declared the danger finished. Instead, the deaths simply grew less frequent. A day passed without burial, then two, then a week. People noticed cautiously. They did not celebrate. They waited. Winter deepened, and with it came a kind of suspended stillness. Frost silvered the rooftops. Smoke rose straight upward in the cold, untroubled by wind. The town, though diminished, remained standing. Survival felt less like triumph and more like endurance. In the months that followed, something unfamiliar settled in. Space. There was more room in the streets. More room in homes. More room in the fields. Houses once crowded now felt almost echoing. Some were claimed by distant relatives. Others stood empty long enough that vines began to creep along their beams. Doors hung slightly open, as though still expecting someone to return. The marketplace reopened slowly. Not all stalls returned, but enough did that trade resumed in fragments. Bread reappeared more consistently. Cloth was sold again, though in smaller quantities. Conversation returned in soft waves. Yet the tone had changed. Before the plague, the market buzzed with layered voices and casual haggling. Now, exchanges were quieter, more deliberate. People looked at one another differently, not with suspicion as during the worst months, but with shared recognition. You survived. That understanding needed no words. Fields once abandoned were divided anew. With so many dead, land ownership shifted. Labor became valuable in ways it had not been before. Survivors found themselves in demand. In parts of Europe, peasants began negotiating wages. Some refused to work for former rates. Lords, faced with too few hands to harvest crops, had little choice but to offer more favorable terms. The old hierarchies did not collapse overnight, but they loosened. In the town, a young farmhand who once served under strict oversight now managed his own strip of land. A widow inherited property she never expected to control. Apprentices stepped into the roles of masters simply because no one else remained. The church, too, was altered. So many clergy had died that replacements were rushed into service. Some were young and inexperienced. Others were drawn from lower ranks than would previously have been permitted. The authority of the church did not vanish, but it felt less unshakable. Faith endured deeply, but it carried new questions within it. If God had allowed such devastation, what did that mean? Some found their devotion strengthened by survival. Others held their belief more quietly, less certain of its structure. Memory became a kind of invisible architecture. People spoke of the plague in careful tones, not dramatically, not with vivid detail, but as something that divided time. Before the plague, after the plague. Children who had been too young to remember asked questions about the empty houses. Adults answered simply. There had been sickness. Many had died. Sometimes in the evenings, someone would mention a name, a friend, a brother, a neighbor, and the room would grow briefly still. But life pressed forward. Spring eventually returned. Green pushed through soil that had been turned too often for graves. Birds nested again in ease. Lambs bleated in distant fields. The cycles of nature had continued even as human cycles fractured. There was something both comforting and unsettling in that continuity. The world had not ended. The sun still rose at dawn. The river still flowed past the town walls. The sky still filled with stars at night. And yet, the town itself was no longer what it had been. It was smaller, quieter, older in spirit. Across Europe, entire regions felt this shift. Cities like Florence, Paris, and London had lost immense portions of their populations. Trade networks would eventually recover, but not unchanged. Labor shortages altered economies. Land passed into new hands. Social mobility, once tightly constrained, widened slightly. The plague had not merely killed, it had rearranged. In the town, marriages occurred between survivors who might never have spoken before. Alliances shifted. Old family lines ended abruptly. New ones began unexpectedly. There was grief still, deep and quiet, but it no longer dominated every hour. The bell in the church tower resumed marking time rather than mourning. Its tone, once constant with funerals, returned to its original rhythm. Morning, midday, evening. Routine, fragile but persistent, rebuilt itself. The baker trained a new apprentice. The forge burned again under steadier hands. The tavern filled slowly in the evenings, though never as crowded as before. Laughter returned carefully, not loud at first, but real. The memory of the plague lingered in habits. People washed more frequently when they could. They avoided certain crowded spaces during times of illness. They spoke more openly about death, having seen it too closely to pretend it was distant. And yet, as years passed, children grew who had no memory of the first wave. For them, the plague became a story told by elders. A story of bells ringing constantly, of empty streets, of fear thick as fog. They listened with curiosity rather than dread. Time softened the edges, but it did not erase them. The town, though altered, endured. Its stone church still stood against the horizon. Its walls still marked boundary. Its wells still offered water drawn from deep, unseen sources. If you walked its streets years later, you would see signs of change. Repaired roofs on houses that had once stood empty, larger plots of land farmed by fewer families, apprentices promoted too young into mastery. But you would also see continuity. Smoke rising at dawn, bread cooling on wooden boards, children running between buildings, their voices echoing lightly against stone. The plague had passed through like a shadow. It had darkened everything. It had hollowed. It had taken. But it had not erased humanity's quiet persistence. And so the town lived on, scarred, changed, aware of its fragility, yet still waking each morning to the same bell, the same light breaking over rooftops, the same slow rhythm of existence. History would remember the Black Death as one of the greatest catastrophes Europe had ever faced. But for those who lived through it, it was not an abstract event. And in the end, it was also this, the simple, stubborn act of continuing. The sun rising again over a town that had nearly fallen silent, and finding, in its streets, life still moving.